Hello, I'm Charles Britt, and today I'm going to give you a brief, an informational brief on a faction of the Yakuza within the nation of Japan. That faction is the Yamaguchi-Gumi. So, background on Japanese organized crime: Yakuza, translated to English, simply means gangster. It's an umbrella term for organized crime within Japan. Uh, the Yamaguchi-Gumi is a faction of the Yakuza. Um, if you were to think of the Italian mafia in the United States, particularly New York City, mafia would be the term most closely associated to Yakuza. And then the Bonanno family or the Lucchese family, as one of the five families, uh, would be the closest relation to what the Yamaguchi Gumi is. They are, in essence, the top family or faction of Yakuza within Japan. They were founded in 1915 um, by their founding father, Harukichi Yamaguchi. And they started out organizing unions of dock workers in occupied Japan post World War II. Um, that was where they started kind of building their talent base and seeing their first bit of profits was um, as a dock worker union uh, in Kobe. Kobe's a port city in Japan. It wasn't until their third generation leader, Kazuo Tuaka, that they started to kind of take the forefront of Yakuza and become the lead faction. And it's been that way since post-occupied World War II Japan. So since the early 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, into today, they are still considered the lead faction, the controlling faction of the Yakuza within Japan. They, in the early days of membership in that 1915 timeframe where they started, this was a part of Japan's history where you could kind of see the early phases of a technological boom. Gone were the days of traditional Japanese society, a samurai society. They started to embrace Western technology, Western business. They embraced the industrial age. And so these samurai who lived out in the country, who were belonged to warring tribal factions, had no real way to continue that lifestyle. And that manifested itself into them finding jobs as hired assassins, hired guns, so to speak. They became bodyguards and petty criminals. That is the traditionally viewed as the very start of Japanese Yakuza, Japanese organized crime. In shifting away from former samurai, they recruited a lot of Japanese Korean mixed race individuals. During World War II, Japan occupied Korea, took on Korean soldiers into the Japanese army, conscripted them, and then took Japanese or Korean women as what they called comfort women. In essence, they were trafficked to use for sex slavery, things of that nature. And so, as you can imagine, these women had kids with Japanese men. These half Japanese, half Korean children were viewed as second-class citizens. A vast majority of those young boys grew up marginalized, disenfranchised, underprivileged, and sought some sort of familial organization to kind of get a sense of belonging that, in essence, was the Yakuza. It's estimated that right now 33% of all Yakuza are descendant from Korean comfort women from the post-World War II era of Japan. So that's how they got their start. That was how they recruited, and that's how they built up their numbers. They are different from other popular factions of organized crime in that they make very valid attempts to lead their life of crime with very minimal violence. And that any violence that does creep up is almost exclusively between Yakuza. They do not target civilians. They do not attack civilians. Historically, they have profited off of protection money of civilian businesses. Unlike the Russian Bratva or the Italian Mafia, there's not a lot of credible reporting that shows that they ever hurt those business leaders. They attempted to extort that money for protection, but in the event those business leaders, business men and women could not pay, they were not targeted by the Yakuza for violence. They have gone out of the way to, one, not commit violence that spreads widely in the news, so as not to bring shame on the organization, and not to target civilians. And a lot of that can be traced back to just overall Japanese culture and Asian culture as a whole. It's an honor-bound culture. Japanese take very seriously the sense of honor that comes from facing Yakuza versus Yakuza. There's no real honor in hurting civilians in their eyes, so they typically avoid it almost at all costs. They're not a very violent group. There's been very few cases of Yakuza murders in the 21st century. It's fairly limited to the point where when it does happen, it's a major news story within Japan, and it brings shame on the Yakuza, and it's avoided at all costs. Typically, any Yakuza who kills another Yakuza, it's almost viewed as going outside of the faction or the family and performing that action. They, for a very long time, for most of the 20th century, the Yakuza worked sort of in a collaborative relationship with the government of Japan. The government of Japan did not put extensive resources into shutting down the Yakuza, into stopping the individual crimes they commit. They were viewed almost as a necessity for Japanese life. The Japanese National Police Agency, in fact, would go out of their way to protect large Yakuza gatherings in order to ensure that there was no attempts on their life. There was no inter-Yakuza warring that would bring news headlines and stories. The Japanese government would use the Yakuza to control petty street crime. So while the Yakuza themselves did not commit petty street crime, they would enforce their own brand of justice on those that did. They frowned upon anything that targeted and hurt civilians, and they cracked down on street crime within the districts or the territory that they controlled. Now, they profited a great deal off of a number of illegal activities. Gambling, loan sharking, obviously money laundering. But in a sense, they were almost victimless crimes. Again, they did not target Japanese civilians, but they did commit traditional organized crime activities. Prostitution. They did not traffic in drugs. Again, it's an honor-bound or sense of organized crime. Drugs are very taboo within the nation of Japan, and the Yakuza did not and do not drug traffic at the major faction level. There are smaller groups of Yakuza with younger memberships who have kind of turned to drug trafficking and crimes that do target civilians. But typically the older factions like the Yamaguchi-Gumi try to tamper this and keep it under control. They do partake in white-collar crime. Underground casinos are very common. Sports betting. They are involved in construction, contracting, as kind of a middleman between large corporations and government entities, and then the actual people conducting the construction. And they bid rigging would be the best way to explain it. They rig the bids so that companies they're affiliated with will get the contracts, and those contracts come down from the government and larger corporations, and they fix those. They're involved in that sort of white collar crime. They do a lot of legitimate business and then mask their illegal earnings through those legitimate businesses, again, which aren't heavily cracked down upon by the Japanese government because they're seen as a necessary part of Japanese life. Again, they're not violent. Any action of a Yakuza that leads to violence is a very rare occurrence and gets a lot of headlines. There is no credible reporting that links the Yakuza to terror groups. Again, Japanese society, honor-bound Asian culture, they are not involved with terror groups, and there's no reporting, credible or otherwise, that links them to groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Recently, Japan has started to crack down on the Yakuza. Japan has joined the United Nations effort against organized crime and transnational organized crime, and that has started since 2017. They've kind of started to crack down on the Yakuza, which is leading to stiffer prison sentences for Japanese organized crime, which has led to a reduction in membership. There's an inability of the Yakuza to recruit at the ground level, which is in direct correlation to these advanced organized crime laws that Japan has passed since 2017 and made a more concerted effort to crack down on organized crime. They are involved in cybercrime. As with the rest of the world and the rest of organized crime, they've embraced cryptocurrency. They do traffic in cryptocurrency. They use it as a means to launder money. The Yakuza is a dwindling sense of organized crime within Japan. Japan is starting to crack down on the Yakuza. That coupled with their desire to remain a non-violent organization has kind of led them to a crossroads. Whereas the Italian mafia, when cracked down, finds ways to develop revenue streams. They're not the Italian mafia, the Russian Bratva are not against going to war against each other for territory and profits and revenue or against civilians. The Japanese Yakuza simply avoid that and almost never engage in those activities, and it's led to a decline in their gross revenue, their revenue streams, and their ability to recruit. So you're seeing a decline in the Yakuza, and particularly the Yamaguchi-Gumi.